predictions about the future often look absurd in hindsight. I mean, flying cars never arrived, yet the smartphone quietly transformed the entire planet.
It really did. Just totally snuck up on us.
Yeah. Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world. I'm your host, and today we are jumping into a deep dive on a seriously fascinating mission.
We really are.
We're unpacking the core ideas from this brilliant book, The Skeptics' Guide to the Future by Dr. Stephen Novella and his co-authors. And I want to be clear right up front for you listening, our goal today is a little different from just, geeking out over cool sci-fi gadgets or laughing at retro magazines.
Right.
Rather than treating futurism as just entertainment or wild speculation, we're going to examine the actual system of technological prediction itself. We want to understand exactly how societies attempt to extrapolate future technologies from present trends. Because the crazy thing is,
They fail constantly.
yes,
Yeah.
they fail constantly, and they don't just fail randomly. We are looking at the hidden machinery behind the guesswork.
That framing is so important because humans are naturally drawn to imagining the future. It's practically baked into our hardware.
Totally.
You have governments that have to do it just to plan multi-decade infrastructure projects. You have venture capitalists, investors who do it to speculate on emerging industries.
Hoping to catch the next big wave, right?
Exactly. And of course, science fiction writers do it to dream up worlds that just haven't arrived yet. It's an irresistible, completely necessary urge. Yet, despite all the funding, the brilliant minds, the massive think tanks dedicated to this, the forecasts are spectacularly wrong most of the time.
Like almost comically wrong sometimes.
Oh, absolutely. What Stephen Novella and his co-authors argue is that these failures are systemic. They are recurring patterns shaped by deep-seated human biases, unexamined assumptions, and a fundamental misinterpretation of how complex technological systems actually interact with human society.
Okay, let's unpack this. I think everyone listening right now has had that moment. You're watching an old movie or you see a retro poster from the 1950s illustrating the year 2000 and you just laugh.
The silver jumpsuits?
The jumpsuits. They've got families having a picnic on the moon wearing silver jumpsuits, but the mom is still vacuuming the crater with a corded appliance.
Yes.
Why are our visions of tomorrow so consistently structurally flawed? Like, what is the trap you're all falling into?
So the most persistent error, what the book identifies as the very first futurism fallacy, is our tendency to drastically overestimate short-term progress while simultaneously underestimating long-term transformation.
Okay, so we get the immediate stuff wrong but miss the big picture.
Exactly. People project these massive, dramatic, earth-shattering changes happening in the next 10 to 15 years, but because they are so focused on those flashy short-term fireworks, they completely miss the slower structural shifts that actually end up reorganizing the entire planet over the span of 50 years.
Oh, I see.
When we try to glimpse the future, say 20 years out, we imagine that whatever the next big anticipated advance is has already completely saturated society. We mentally compress the timeline of innovation.
Right, I was looking at the historical examples they laid out for this, and the 1964 World's Fair in New York is just the perfect time capsule.
Oh, it really is.
You have Isaac Asimov, undeniably one of the greatest sci-fi minds and scientific communicators in human history, making these highly publicized predictions for the year 2014. So exactly 50 years out. He published these in the New York Times.
And he went big.
Huge. He predicted that by 2014, we would have experimental fusion power plants up and running. He predicted massive solar power stations operating in space, collecting sunlight with huge parabolic focusing devices, and beaming the energy down to Earth via microwaves.
Which sounds amazing.
It sounds incredible.
Yeah.
But sitting here today, those predictions weren't just a little off. They were at least a half-century premature, if not a full century.
It really highlights the sheer power of the optimism of that specific era. Asimov was a genius, but he fell face first into the trap of the immediate. You have to remember the cultural context of 1964. The Apollo program was in full swing, nuclear power was scaling up, and it genuinely felt like humanity was conquering physics at a breakneck pace.
Like we could do anything.
Right. Asimov assumed a smooth, rapid, uninterrupted continuation of those massive scientific strides. He thought we would just keep iterating on big, heavy infrastructure at the exact same speed.
Just a straight line up?
Exactly. But this overestimation of the short term comes partly from a glitch in how the human brain processes time itself. There's a striking historical timeline analogy in the book that perfectly captures how we compress eras in our minds. Consider Cleopatra.
Oh, this part broke my brain.
It's wild. Most people lump her into the bucket of ancient history alongside the pharaohs who built the pyramids. But chronologically, Cleopatra lived closer in time to the launch of the space shuttle than she did to the building of the pyramids of Giza.
I actually had to stop reading, pull out my phone, and do the math on that. But it's true. Cleopatra died around 30 BCE. Great Pyramid was built around 2500 BCE.
Right.
That's a gap of nearly 2.5 millennia. But from Cleopatra to the 1981 space shuttle launch is less than 2,000 years. It feels completely counterintuitive.
It feels counterintuitive because our brains aren't naturally wired to grasp deep time. We tend to lump everything ancient into one indistinct, compressed era called the past. Just like we lump everything yet to come into one homogeneous bucket called the future.
Yeah, that makes sense.
We don't feel the vast empty spaces between events. And if we want to understand why we get the timelines of technological forecasting so wrong, we have to look at the math of innovation. Technological progress is frequently geometric or exponential rather than linear.
Okay, issue.
Linear progress is simple addition. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You take a step, you move 1 meter. Geometric progress is a multiplier. 2, 4, 8, 16, 32.
So just to make sure I'm wrapping my head around this for myself and everyone listening, this is like that old riddle about folding a piece of paper, right?
Yes, Kingsley.
Where if you fold a standard piece of paper in half, and then in half again, and you keep doubling its thickness, it doesn't just get a little thicker. By the time you sold it 42 times, that stack of paper reaches the moon.
That is the exact perfect analogy. Our brains think linearly. We think 42 folds is maybe the thickness of a thick book. We simply cannot intuit that it reaches the moon.
It's just too big of a jump.
Right. The classic technological example of this is Moore's Law. Gordon Moore, the co-founder of Intel, observed back in 1965 that the number of transistors you could fit on a silicon chip was doubling roughly every 18 to 24 months.
Every 2 years, basically.
Yep. Because of this geometric progression, computer processors haven't just become a few times faster over the last half-century. They have become millions of times faster, smaller, and cheaper.
But wait, I have a question here. If we know about Moore's Law, and if we know progress is geometric because of these multipliers, why are the smartest futurists still getting the timeline wrong today? Haven't we learned the math by now? Why do we keep falling for this idea of linear, straight-line progress?
That is a fantastic pushback, and the answer lies in the concept of technological roadblocks and diminishing returns. What the authors call technological linearity is the false assumption that progress, even exponential progress, continues smoothly without friction.
Ah, okay, the friction.
Right. If you just draw a straight line upward on a graph, you assume you'll inevitably hit flying cars and commercial fusion power in 20 years. What this ignores is that reality pushes back. Eventually, you pick all the low-hanging fruit of a specific technology. Sometimes a technology hits a fundamental wall in physics.
Like what?
Well, for example, with silicon chips, we are now getting to the point where the transistors are so small, we have to worry about quantum tunneling. Electrons basically teleporting across barriers because the walls are only a few atoms thick. You can't just keep shrinking them forever.
So the progress just stops.
It stalls out on that specific paradigm.
Right.
It requires an entirely new branch of physics or a completely new engineering approach like quantum computing or optical computing to overcome the wall. We overestimate the short term because we ignore those roadblocks.
We think the paper will just keep folding easily forever.
Exactly. But then conversely, we underestimate the long term because while one technology stalls, a completely different, unpredicted geometric explosion in a new paradigm eventually catches up, blindsides us, and reshapes the world in ways the linear thinkers couldn't even fathom.
Which is the perfect pivot to the next massive blind spot.
Right.
And if you are listening to this deep dive on a smartphone right now, you are holding the exact piece of technology that mid-century geniuses failed to predict.
You really are.
You are literally holding the blind spot. The authors call this the steampunk fallacy, or futurism fallacy number 8.
Yeah.
It's the tendency to extrapolate existing technology into the future without anticipating new, disruptive technologies.
Yeah.
And the example of Isaac Asimov's Foundation series is just wild to me.
Let's dive into that because the Foundation series is a masterpiece of science fiction, but it is also a masterclass in this specific fallacy.
Right. He writes this sweeping, epic galactic saga in the 1940s and 50s. It is set thousands of years in the future. Humanity spans millions of worlds across the Milky Way. They have hyperdrive.
The scale is massive.
But he imagines a completely analog universe. In the early books, computers essentially don't exist. The characters are calculating hyperspace jumps using slide rules and consulting information on microfilm.
Microfilm in space.
Yes. It is basically a steampunk reality, just with spaceships instead of steam trains. It shows this deep human tendency to just take whatever is sitting on our desk right now and imagine the future as just a bigger, shinier, or faster version of that exact same object. We completely miss the fact that a paradigm shift might come along and make the thing on our desk entirely obsolete.
Think about how profound that is. A visionary who could imagine a galactic empire couldn't imagine the microchip.
Wow. Yeah.
If we connect this to the broader historical picture, you see this exact fallacy perfectly illustrated by how earlier generations viewed the dawn of the 21st century. Futurists in the 1950s and 60s were utterly obsessed with transportation and heavy mechanics.
Oh, for sure.
They looked at the automobile and the airplane, extrapolated a linear line, and imagined a year 2000 filled with flying cars, personal jetpacks, monorails on every corner, and bulky humanoid robotic servants doing the laundry. But almost no one predicted the digital revolution. They missed the disruption of digitalization, miniaturization, and network information.
Because everyone was looking up at the sky waiting for the flying cars to arrive, while the actual revolution was quietly, invisibly slipping into our pockets.
Exactly.
And the smartphone didn't fulfill that classic sci-fi fantasy. It didn't solve highway traffic by taking us up into the clouds. Instead, it quietly and profoundly reorganized global economics. It changed human communication, dating, politics, and societal behavior.
It changed everything.
We are all walking around with sleek supercomputers that hold the sum total of human knowledge, but because it doesn't look like an episode of The Jetsons, it doesn't immediately feel like the future we were promised.
It's a failure of imagination regarding disruption. Futurists of the early 19th century imagined faster horses and steamships. They missed electronics entirely. Futurists of the early 20th century missed computers. Mid-century futurists missed the miniaturization of computers and the internet. We constantly imagine a future built firmly on the foundation of today's cutting-edge tech. What we fail to realize is that tomorrow's disruptive tech doesn't build on the foundation, it replaces the foundation entirely.
Though to be fair, there is one incredibly rare exception to this that I found absolutely delightful.
Oh, Mark Twain.
Mark Twain, yes. Samuel Clemens himself. In 1898, he wrote a short story where he essentially predicted the internet with shocking accuracy. He imagined a device he called a telelectroscope.
Such a great word.
Right. He described it as a system connected to the worldwide telephone network that made the daily doings of the entire globe visible to anyone. He literally wrote about people sitting in their homes, observing and discussing events happening across the world in real time on screens.
In 1898.
In 1898. It is staggering that a guy famous for writing about steamboats on the Mississippi in the 19th century got closer to predicting the social impact of the internet than the hardened technologists of the 1960s.
It is a remarkable piece of foresight, largely because Twain was focusing on human behavior, our insatiable desire for connection and gossip, rather than getting bogged down in the engineering mechanics.
He knew people.
He knew people. But Twain remains the exception that proves the rule. Generally, we are completely blind to disruption. And this ties directly into another major recurring error that systems analysis reveals. We constantly, almost comically, underestimate the degree to which past and current technology persists into the future.
Yes.
The book frames this as futurism fallacies number 2 and number 5. We seem to have this built-in, unexamined assumption that in the future, everything will be completely different, simply because technology will allow it to be different.
I love this part because it exposes how ridiculous our assumptions are. There was this vivid description of a promotional film from 1967. It was made by the Philco Ford Corporation, and they were trying to predict what a typical home would look like in the distant, exotic year of 1999.
The exotic year of 1999.
And the star of this short film is a young Wink Martindale. They imagine the home of the future being run by a massive, all-knowing central computer. So far, so good.
Sure, that tracks.
But because they couldn't see past their current paradigm, the steampunk fallacy again, they imagined this computer taking up an entire dedicated room in the house. Wink Martindale is sitting at this massive console filled with blinking 1950s-style switches, dials, and vacuum tubes, printing out paper reports about his home's temperature.
Printing them on paper.
On paper. They literally couldn't imagine a microchip that would make all of that invisible.
They correctly guessed the function that computation would be central to home management. But they completely failed on the form. They assumed the physical footprint of that technology would just be a scaled-up, glossier version of the mainframes they already had at corporate headquarters. They assumed you needed a bulky command center to achieve home automation, instead of a thermostat the size of a hockey puck that connects to Wi-Fi.
But even beyond the form of new tech, we forget that old tech doesn't just vanish. The book uses this brilliant analogy about the modern kitchen to explain why ancient tools survive. When you picture a highly futuristic sci-fi kitchen, you usually imagine a wall panel that materializes a 5-course meal out of thin air, or maybe lasers that cook a steak instantly.
It's a Star Trek replicator.
Exactly. We assume future cooking will be entirely overhauled just because it can be. But I want you, the listener, to think about the kitchen you made breakfast in this morning. If you walk into a multi-million-dollar state-of-the-art kitchen today, what are the primary tools? You see forged metal knives, you see wooden cutting boards, you see the application of thermal heat from fire or coils to raw organic ingredients.
Very old technology.
These are techniques and tools that are literally thousands of years old.
It's a profound realization when you apply systems analysis. Sometimes we do things the old-fashioned way because the old-fashioned way is already at the absolute peak of optimization.
Right. It ain't broke, don't fix it.
Exactly. A sharpened wedge of high-carbon steel is an incredibly efficient, elegant tool for dicing an onion. We don't need a high-powered laser to do it. A laser would be infinitely more complicated, dangerous, and energy-intensive for no added benefit.
And terrible for the onion.
Terrible for the onion. The biggest actual technological innovation in the modern kitchen over the last century was the microwave oven. And as Stephen Novella notes, despite all the hype when it was introduced, most of us primarily use it just for reheating leftovers or popping popcorn.
Well,
It did not fundamentally rewrite how we prepare cuisine.
that's so true.
We have this intellectually lazy assumption that everything in the future will be about optimizing convenience above all else. But human behavior and desire are far more complex. Sometimes we actually enjoy the ritual of the analog process. The tactile sensation of cooking is part of the human experience.
Which perfectly dismantles this massive societal myth, the myth of the leisure utopia. This really struck a chord with me. We've been sold this narrative for over a century, that technological progress inevitably leads to this absolute paradise of increased leisure time and effortless convenience.
The post-work society.
Right. The book mentions this incredibly goofy 1920s film called Looking Forward to the Future. It predicted a post-war world of never-ending peace, where people wear electric belts that allow them to personally control their local climate bubble. And my absolute favorite part. It predicted that modern men of the future would wear utility belts containing a telephone, a radio, and little containers for, quote, candy for cuties.
Candy for cuties. It's incredibly funny to look back on, but it reveals a very specific, culturally bound mindset. The assumption in the 1920s, coming off the dizzying early benefits of the Industrial Revolution, was that machines taking over physical drudgery would eventually free humans from having to work entirely.
They just assumed we'd be chilling.
They extrapolated the trend of industrial factory efficiency and assumed it would result in a utopian leisure society where our biggest problem was managing our personal climate belts. But history doesn't stop. Society doesn't reach a finish line and just relax. It keeps churning. The baseline of expectations simply moves.
Let's take that a step further, because the way the 40-hour work week is deconstructed here is eye-opening. A lot of people today casually assume that the 5-day, 40-hour work week was some sort of natural gift graciously bestowed upon us by the efficiency of machines and Henry Ford.
Right, like the machines just gave us the weekend.
Exactly. But history shows it wasn't a gift of technology at all. It was fought for tooth and nail. It was won through a century of brutal, literal blood-in-the-streets labor union fights, which were finally codified into federal law in the United States in 1940. And if you look at modern technology today, the smartphone, ubiquitous high-speed internet, the gig economy, apps like Uber or Slack, they haven't gifted the average person more leisure time.
Not at all.
For many, they have actually radically increased working hours. We've completely blurred the lines between the office and the home. You can now work a 100-hour week without ever leaving your couch.
This raises a deeply uncomfortable question about our forecasting system. What unexamined cultural assumptions are we making right now that are coloring our thinking about the year 2050 or 2100? We still implicitly equate technological progress with human convenience and increased leisure, but the reality of how human beings adapt to technology is far more chaotic.
Messy.
Very messy. And this brings us to a crucial cluster of fallacies, what the authors categorize as the chaos of human adoption. The core concept here is that while technology evolves rapidly, people, cultural norms, and economic incentives evolve too, and they do it in messy, unpredictable ways. We cannot simply place a modern person with a 2026 mindset and current cultural norms into a shiny future setting and call it a prediction.
The cultural blind spot. This is exactly why so many highly budgeted sci-fi movies look incredibly dated just 10 or 20 years later. It's not the special effects that age poorly, it's the social dynamics.
Absolutely.
The text references the classic 1956 sci-fi film Forbidden Planet. It's a gorgeous movie, supposedly set in the 23rd century. They have a faster-than-light starship, advanced robotics, laser weapons. But the crew of this starship acts exactly like a World War II naval battleship crew.
Yes.
The gender dynamics, the rigid military chain of command, the mid-century slang they use it is perfectly, undeniably 1956. The creators couldn't imagine that if technology leaped forward 300 years, human social structures would also radically transform. I also love the reference to the video game series Fallout.
Oh, that's a perfect example.
The creators of that game use this fallacy as a deliberate, brilliant aesthetic choice. It's called retro-futurism. The game is set over 100 years in the future after a nuclear war, but the culture is permanently frozen in the 1950s. You have nuclear-powered hover cars and incredibly advanced robot butlers, but everyone still wears fedoras, watches black and white television, and listens to doo-wop music. It's a satire of how we predict the future.
It perfectly highlights the absurdity of assuming that society will remain static while technology leaps forward. People and technology evolve together as a dynamic, deeply intertwined system. When you introduce a new piece of technology, say the birth control pill or the smartphone, it fundamentally changes how people behave. That behavioral shift changes cultural norms and economic models, which in turn drives the demand for completely different types of technology.
It's a loop.
It's a constant feedback loop. Yet, professional futurists tend to imagine that time stands still for human culture, while only the machines on the assembly line change.
And tied to that is this wild, almost arrogant illusion of planned progress. It was a 1935 film called City of the Future that literally stated in its narration that in the future, every single detail of society would be logically planned and deliberate. It is this incredibly utopian, or honestly highly dystopian, depending on how you look at it, idea that some completely rational, benevolent authority will craft our future to perfectly meet our needs without any friction. Everything will be zoned perfectly, traffic will flow seamlessly, and society will operate like a Swiss watch.
Reality, as any systems analyst will tell you, is far messier than that. The deep philosophical principle that stuff happens continues to dictate the human trajectory.
Stuff happens. That's the scientific term.
That's the technical term, yeah.
Yeah.
Innovation does not happen in a sterile laboratory vacuum. It is immediately thrown into the mud of the real world. It has to interact with crumbling existing infrastructure, complex and often perverse economic incentives, labyrinthine regulatory hurdles, and, most importantly, human quirkiness.
Human quirkiness is the ultimate wild card. The history of tech is littered with logical predictions that were derailed just because humans are weird. I want to highlight two fantastic examples of this. First, the video phone versus texting.
I love this one.
Video phones have been a staple of science fiction since the 1920s. Every futuristic show, from Metropolis to Blade Runner, featured people communicating on high-resolution screens. It was considered an absolute inevitability. And yet, when the technology actually arrived, matured, and became incredibly cheap, when we all literally had high-definition cameras connected to global networks in our pockets, what did people overwhelmingly prefer to do?
We tapped.
We preferred to silently tap out text messages to each other. I guarantee you no futurist in 1960 predicted that social anxiety, the desire to multitask, or the simple preference for asynchronous communication would make typing text dominant over real-time video calls.
It's a perfect example of technology colliding with psychology. Or consider the Segway.
Oh man, the Segway.
If we look back to the turn of the millennium when the Segway was first announced under the codename Ginger, it was hyped by the most prominent tech visionaries on the planet as a revolution that would completely change how human cities were built. Steve Jobs famously told the inventor, Dean Kamen, that it would be as big a deal as the personal computer.
That is some serious hype.
It was undeniably a technological marvel of self-balancing gyroscopic engineering. But society utterly rejected it as a mass transit solution. Why? Because it was impractical, it was too expensive, it was awkward to use on crowded sidewalks where you had to dodge pedestrians, and frankly, you just looked a bit silly riding one.
You really did.
The hardest thing to predict about technology isn't whether the physics or the engineering will work, it is how humans will respond to it in the wild. Assuming that an objectively superior piece of engineering will always win out in the marketplace is a massive fallacy. The market is driven by quirky, unpredictable human choices and cultural aesthetics.
So if the reality of innovation is this messy, chaotic, two steps forward, one step back dance, why do we keep getting fed these neat, tidy, dramatic visions of the future? Why does every magazine cover promise a revolution by next Tuesday?
That comes down to institutional incentives, which create a powerful, distortionary feedback loop. Think about the players involved in the system of prediction. First, the media. Media organizations amplify dramatic, sensational predictions because utopian dreams or apocalyptic nightmares are what attract eyeballs, clicks, and subscriptions.
Right, fear and excitement sell.
Second, the technology companies themselves. They actively promote highly optimistic, sanitized visions of their products because they need to attract massive amounts of venture capital and public investment. Finally, the futurists and think tank analysts face intense professional pressure to produce bold, definitive, highly quotable forecasts.
They have to justify their jobs.
Exactly. If a futurist goes on stage and says, well, the future will probably be a messy hybrid of old and new tech, largely dependent on unpredictable cultural whims and bureaucratic zoning laws, that doesn't sell best-selling books or get you invited to give a TED Talk. This incentive structure deeply obscures the underlying reality of how innovation actually happens, burying the nuance under a mountain of hype.
Okay, so what does this all mean for us today? If the whole system of prediction is rigged by hype and human blind spots, how do we break out of these fallacies? The book makes this fantastic pivot from tearing down past mistakes to applying scientific skepticism to the emerging tech we're dealing with right now. Let's look at the biggest elephant in the room.
Artificial intelligence.
Artificial intelligence. When the average person thinks of future AI, their mind instantly goes to AGI, artificial general intelligence. It's the classic sci-fi fear. A super smart computer wakes up, achieves human-level consciousness, decides humanity is a threat or an annoyance, and takes over the world. But examining the actual system reveals that this fear completely obscures the real immediate risks.
Yes, the cultural fixation on AGI, the Terminator, or Skynet scenario is largely a distraction. We don't even have a scientific consensus on what human consciousness actually is, let alone how to code it into a machine. The present tangible danger lies in ANI, or artificial narrow intelligence. ANI algorithms are already ubiquitous in our society. To explain the difference simply, narrow AI doesn't have consciousness, it doesn't have desires, and it doesn't think. It is essentially just an incredibly powerful, hyper-fast sorting machine designed to optimize for one very specific mathematical goal.
Okay.
And the real danger isn't a robot uprising. It is the unintended, catastrophic consequences of poorly engineered, narrow AI interacting with complex human social systems.
I mean, we are seeing this play out in real time with social media algorithms. These algorithms are prime examples of narrow AI. They are designed with one specific goal: to maximize user engagement and keep you scrolling so the platform can serve you more ads. The AI doesn't want to harm society. It doesn't hate democracy. But by ruthlessly optimizing for clicks and watch time, the algorithm quickly learned that human beings engage most heavily with content that makes them angry or fearful.
The rage algorithm.
The rage algorithm. So it inadvertently drives political radicalization, pushes wild conspiracy theories, and physically fractures our shared sense of reality. That isn't a sci-fi fantasy happening in 2050. That is a massive structural technological crisis happening right now.
Absolutely right now.
Or think about the engineering hurdles of self-driving cars. Everyone thought we'd have autonomous fleets by 2020. But the hurdle wasn't making the car stay in the lane. The hurdle is the ethical programming required for edge cases. It's the classic trolley problem brought to life. If a crash is mathematically unavoidable, does the narrow AI choose to swerve and protect the pedestrian, or does it prioritize the safety of the driver who bought the car? How do you code that?
You can't just throw math at that.
Right. These are the real, messy, incredibly difficult philosophical and engineering problems of our future. We aren't going to be fighting sentient androids with laser rifles. We're going to be fighting out the liability law of algorithmic decision-making.
That analysis is the very essence of skeptical futurism. evaluating the plausible over the fantastical, and focusing on systemic impacts rather than cinematic explosions. And we see this exact same rigorous principle applied to another frontier in the book, biotechnology and synthetic life.
Oh, this part is wild.
This is where the concepts get truly profound and challenge our basic definitions of nature. For decades, we have been modifying existing DNA using tools to snip and tinker with what natural evolution has already built. But we are moving toward a threshold of building organisms completely from the ground up. True synthetic life.
I found the distinction the authors make between natural evolution and top-down engineering so illuminating. They use the example of the vertebrate eye, and it's brilliant. If you were a top-tier engineer hired to design a camera, you would logically put the light-sensing pixels right at the front, facing the lens, with all the wiring tucked neatly behind them. That's just basic logical design.
Right, common sense.
But the human eye, which was shaped by millions of years of messy, random evolutionary mutations, is actually wired backward. We have the light-sensing cells on the bottom layer, buried beneath blood vessels and nerve fibers. All that wiring then has to bundle together and plunge back through the retina to reach the brain. This literally creates a blind spot in the center of our vision that our brain has to actively hallucinate to fill in.
It's terrible design.
It's awful. It proves that evolution is not a master engineer, it's a blind tinkerer. It finds good enough solutions that are often deeply suboptimal and inefficient, but as long as the organism survives to reproduce, the messy design gets passed down.
It's a crucial concept to grasp. Evolved biological systems carry massive amounts of historical baggage and inefficiency. We are running on legacy code. The staggering promise of synthetic biology is that it would allow us to engineer biological machines logically, top down from scratch, completely eliminating that evolutionary baggage.
Just wiping the slate clean.
Exactly. Instead of hoping a bacteria mutates to do what we want, we could sit at a computer and design the genetic sequence for an organism exactly suited to a specific need. We could design microbes that secrete clean aviation fuel, or synthetic bacteria designed specifically to eat microplastics in the ocean, or bespoke organisms that synthesize entirely new classes of antibiotics.
But the flip side of that power is terrifying. The risks they outline regarding the maturation of this technology are sobering. They talk about a future where genetic engineering becomes fully automated and miniaturized. I want you to imagine a desktop appliance sitting next to your inkjet printer that can physically print artificial organisms.
Yeah, that's heavy.
The book uses the phrase Photoshop for life. You just open a software program, drag and drop genetic traits on a screen, the AI handles all the insanely complex protein folding calculations in the background, and the machine prints out a custom living microbe into a petri dish. The proliferation risks of that are astronomical. If a depressed teenager or an extremist group can print a highly contagious custom-designed synthetic virus in their garage with a credit card and an internet connection, how do you even begin to secure a global society against that?
It is a genuinely terrifying systems-level vulnerability. It highlights a recurring theme. Highly disruptive technologies don't just solve old problems, they create entirely new categories of existential risks that our current institutions are completely unequipped to handle. And navigating that landscape requires us to rigorously separate what is scientifically plausible, no matter how frightening, from what is pure fantasy. Which brings us to the boundary between hard science fiction, which tries to adhere to the known laws of physics, and science fantasy, which essentially uses technology as a lazy form of magic.
Yes, the sci-fi reality check. And I loved reading this section because it ruins so many of my favorite movies in the best possible way. Let's talk about the absolute holy grail of futuristic predictions: free energy and cold fusion. The text brings up the infamous 1989 press conference held by chemists Martin Fleischmann and Stanley Pons.
Oh, that was a huge moment.
They stood in front of the world's media and announced they had achieved cold fusion, meaning nuclear fusion, occurring at room temperature in a simple tabletop apparatus. If it had been true, it would have changed the trajectory of the human species overnight. It would have meant virtually limitless, clean, cheap energy for everyone forever. It caused an absolute global sensation.
And it turned out to be a textbook case of what scientists call pathological science.
What does that actually mean in practice?
Pathological science happens when researchers are so desperate for a specific outcome, often because the implications are so monumental that their desire literally blinds them to the flaws in their own methodology. They subconsciously trick themselves. Pons and Fleischmann weren't necessarily malicious frauds, they just interpreted ambiguous data in the most favorable light possible. When other labs around the world tried to replicate the experiment, they couldn't. The results were a mirage.
But people still want to believe it.
Oh, absolutely. Yet the allure of hacking the stubborn, unyielding laws of thermodynamics to get free energy is so overwhelmingly powerful that a subculture of garage engineers and fringe scientists still chase it today. We continually dream up these magical energy sources in our fiction, the zero-point modules in Stargate, or Tony Stark's glowing arc reactor in Iron Man. The reason this trope is so persistent is that energy generation is the ultimate bottleneck for any physical civilization.
Right. If you have infinite clean energy, you can solve almost any other physical problem on Earth. You can desalinate the oceans to end water scarcity. You can scrub all the carbon out of the atmosphere. You can travel to the stars. You can power endless server farms for computation. And speaking of sci-fi energy sources, the authors take a hilarious, deeply logical jab at the Matrix.
This is great.
The entire premise of the Matrix is that super-intelligent machines have enslaved humanity, keeping us in vats, using our biological body heat and bioelectricity as batteries to power their civilization. But when you apply actual scientific skepticism to that, it falls apart instantly. Why use humans? Humans are incredibly high maintenance. We have complex psychological needs. We rebel. Our brains require massive amounts of caloric energy just to function. If you are machine intelligence that just needs a biological heat source, pigs or cows would be infinitely more efficient and easier to manage. The pig matrix makes way more scientific sense.
The pig matrix.
You just simulate a nice muddy field for them. But obviously, Keanu Reeves hacking into the pig matrix doesn't make for a very cool Hollywood blockbuster.
It's a very funny observation, but it underscores a much deeper analytical point about how we construct our visions of the future. Science fiction writers frequently reverse engineer solutions to their contemporary narrative problems using futuristic magic without pausing to consider the massive societal reverberations those technologies would actually cause if they existed in reality.
I know exactly where you're going with this. The transporter and the holodeck.
Precisely. Let's take the transporter from Star Trek. From a production standpoint, it was originally invented by the writers in the 1960s simply as a narrative convenience and a budget-saving measure. They didn't have the special effects budget to show a spaceship landing on a new planet every week, so they invented a magic beam to instantly teleport the characters down to the surface. But let's apply systems analysis to that technology. If a machine actually existed that could scan a human body down to the quantum level, dematerialize all the matter, beam that information across space, and perfectly reassemble it, it would fundamentally shatter every single aspect of human civilization. It would mean you have absolute godlike control over matter and information.
Where you wouldn't just use it as a futuristic taxi to get to work faster.
Exactly. If you have that technology, you could cure any disease instantly by simply beaming the cancerous tumor out of a patient's body. You could perfectly replicate any physical object, food, gold, starships, rendering all manufacturing, agriculture, and economic resource scarcity completely obsolete. You would essentially be immortal, because every time you aged or got injured, you could just instruct the transporter to restore your body to a saved backup state from when you were 25.
But in the show, they just use it to commute. They treat this literal godlike power in complete isolation, as if it wouldn't disrupt the entire economic, religious, and social fabric of the universe. It's the exact same blind spot with the holodeck. If you have a technology that can perfectly, flawlessly simulate any reality, any fantasy, any sensation, completely indistinguishable from the real world, why would anyone ever leave that room?
You wouldn't.
Why would a crew risk their lives exploring dangerous, freezing space anomalies when they could be living as literal gods in a simulated utopia of their own design? Sci-fi gives us these incredible world-breaking toys, but it imagines people who are impossibly like us with our 20th century Protestant work ethics and our specific cultural motivations, using them in very restrained ways. Which brings us perfectly to the core synthesis of this entire deep dive. After looking at all these fallacies, the compressed timelines, the blindness to disruption, the persistence of old tech, and the narrative magic of sci-fi, was the actual crisis in perception here. The crisis is that we have been conditioned to treat technological predictions as either inevitable destiny or pure fantastical escapism. We read a headline that says we will have commercial flying cars by 2030, and we either believe it blindly, or when 2030 rolls around and we're still stuck in traffic, we dismiss the entire endeavor of forecasting as a silly dream. Both of these extreme reactions are flawed because they obscure the system itself.
They hide the invisible forces that are actually guiding innovation. That is the crucial takeaway. The system is the vast, messy, complex network of accumulated scientific knowledge interacting with deeply entrenched institutional incentives, stubborn economic realities, unyielding laws of physics, and the constantly shifting cultural narratives that shape development. When predictions are framed in the media as just isolated guesses, like some lone genius throwing a dart at a calendar, the real forces of innovation remain invisible to us.
But we can see them if we look.
Right. When we apply the systems analysis we've discussed today, when we look closely at the historical patterns of geometric growth, the reality of physical roadblocks, the chaos of cultural adoption, and the stubborn persistence of ancient tools, we equip ourselves with much better analytical tools. We learn to separate what is scientifically plausible from what is narratively convenient. We learn to see what is actually coming rather than what we simply wish would arrive.
Here's where it gets really interesting, and I want to leave you with a final, completely mind-bending thought from the book to mull over on your own. We've spent this time talking about how technology is advancing and how it disrupts society. But as this exponential geometric growth continues to accelerate into the deep future, the fundamental distinctions we rely on today to make sense of our world might completely vanish.
Yeah, this is the really heavy stuff.
We are moving toward a reality where mature nanotechnology, programmable matter, and synthetic biology blur the lines completely. Think about it. If you can build a living, breathing organism from scratch using a computer program, and conversely, you can build a functioning computer processor out of biological DNA strands, what is the functional difference between a machine and an animal?
The categories we use to define reality begin to dissolve entirely.
Exactly. Eventually, the hard concepts of natural versus artificial or biological versus machine may be obliterated entirely. The physical world around us might become as malleable and programmable as digital software. And it gets crazier. We ourselves may eventually become what they call substrate independent, meaning the software of human consciousness might not need to run on the biological wet meat of our current brains. We can simply become patterns of digital information running on synthetic networks. Whoever these future people are, whether they are extensively genetically engineered, deeply AI augmented, or living entirely as data in digital ecosystems, they will not be us.
No, they won't.
They won't share our psychology. And as the book profoundly reminds us, those future beings will look back at us, at our frail analog bodies, our crude physical surgeries, our violent resource conflicts, and our rigid binary categories, and they will view us as incredibly quaint and perhaps even deeply barbaric.
It is a profoundly humbling perspective to end on. It serves as a stark reminder that our boldest visions of the future usually say far more about our present limitations, our current anxieties, and our contemporary hubris than they do about tomorrow's actual possibilities.
Crisis in Perception examines how systems shape belief and how better tools help us see clearly. This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon. For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description. If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.